This is the Mac Studio. This is the M1 Max. So there's the M1 Max and there's the M1 Ultra. So the specs of this M1 Ultra chip, it has 10 CPU cores, 24 GPU cores. And it has, this one specifically is spec'd with 32 gigabytes of RAM. And the big portion that is nice about it is that the RAM is pretty quick at 400 gigabytes per second. The cool thing about this, and well, there's a few cool things about it. First thing here is it has an SD card slot. You know, 2 ports at the front, Thunderbolt 4, and then here the I/O on the back is quite good as well. Unlike the Mac Mini, the on button is not underneath it, which is, you know, quite strange that they put that there. But I made a video last week talking about the Mac Mini M4, and the reason why I have this is because I was curious to see what the performance of this was and if it's any better or if it's worse than the Mac Mini M4. So what are the general differences between the two? I think that's what is good to essentially figure out, because Apple does a really good job marketing, but marketing towards actually showing the details around how quick it is in comparison to another device. Now, when comparing apples to apples, I have a MacBook Air M1, and I'm trying to understand if it makes sense to upgrade to one of these devices, and yeah, if it makes sense to use one of those as the daily driver and supplement that with a MacBook Air and use that when I'm traveling around. What's so great about this? I think, honestly, at the moment, it's the price, because these you can find for $1,000, and with the GPU cores, not the CPU cores, the GPU specifically, having 24 cores is probably beneficial in some ways to a lot of people, and having the extra 30, like all the base models of the MacBook Air and so on and so forth, Mac Mini, all come with 16 gigabytes of RAM. My MacBook Air has 8 gigabytes of RAM, and this one has 32 gigabytes of RAM. So I imagine running out of the GPU memory and the system memory is a lot less of an issue. Also, this one comes standard with 512 gigabytes of SSD storage. The main thing to look at for the Mac Studios is that they have, with the M1 Max, and I think this goes through all of the lineups like M1 Max, M2 Max, and M3 Max, is that they come with 2 video encoders. So 2 video encoders and 2 video decoders. What does that mean exactly? So that means that for specific file types like HEVC or H.265 and H.264, as well as ProRes, it does encode, meaning it exports and reads those types of files much faster than it would if it only had one encoder. So the M1 has one encoder, the M4 has one encoder. The one improvement that I would say for a Mac Mini M4 is that it does also have AV1 decode. It doesn't have AV1 encode, but it does have AV1 decode. So that's something to take note. And this is something, it's not like a software thing, it's a hardware thing built in the actual SoC. Something to also note is that the memory bandwidth of the Mac Mini M4 is 120 gigabytes per second versus the 400 gigabytes per second. So you are getting some benefit out of that as well. I think the other, I guess, pro and con is that for a new Mac Mini, obviously you get some warranty, whereas the other ones with the Mac Studios, if you're looking at an old one that's 4 years old, then you're looking at something that is out of warranty. So take that with a grain of salt. I don't know longevity. Obviously, you're not working with a battery or a laptop battery here, so that may not really be a particular issue. It's more so if you're buying it on the used market, how used is it, if you will. I do have some benchmarks to actually look at. in comparison to the Mac Mini M4, and it was with a Final Cut export with a 21-minute clip that's 4K res, and it's H.264. It took the Mac Mini 10 minutes and 56 seconds, and it took the Mac Studio M1 Max 6 minutes and 29 seconds. So roughly half-ish in terms of the time, and it does make sense. It's not one-to-one in terms of like, oh, this one has 2 encoders versus 1 encoder. It does work similarly, but I don't think it scales like that. So for example, if you were doing a M1 Max Ultra, I don't think it's going to take half the time because it has 4 encoders versus 2 encoders for the M1 Max. Taking another look at sort of export times with my workflow, it wasn't like the times were kind of negligible when looking at my other exports and my other tests. So looking at the Insta360 export, those were roughly around the same time. The M1 Max beat it by maybe 6 seconds versus the Mac Mini M4. And then taking a look at the stabilization clips with Catalyst Browse, they're roughly the same time. There is roughly a 10 to 8 second difference in terms of the 3-minute clip and the 5-minute clip. Now looking at the actual CINEBENCH scores, it was kind of surprising here, but not surprising at the same time. So multi-core, since they both have the same amount of cores, 10 cores, it was 13,788 for the Mac Mini, and then 12,385 for the Mac Studio. And then looking at the single core, this is pretty impressive for the Mac Mini with the M4 chips. So 2,272 versus 1,543 for the M1 Max. So what does that mean in real life? So I think in terms of longevity, RAM is really important, but also the outright speed and capability of the chip itself. And looking at the prices, it's just a little bit different. So if you're doing a lot of graphically intensive workflows, like maybe you're running AI models, maybe you're adding a lot of graphics to your timeline when you're exporting in Final Cut, different things to that regard. Your overall time, especially with the encoder, if you're editing videos on Final Cut, then it probably helps you out to have those additional encoders. So for the price, if it's $1,000 versus an M4 Mac Mini, then you're possibly exporting quite a bit faster. So if you're doing this on a regular basis, this will save you quite a bit of time. And imagine for multitasking with the extra 16 gigabytes of RAM, that'll also help you too. So I guess the question is it worth the extra money? Now, if you look at upgrading a Mac Mini M4 to 32 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigabytes of storage, then you're looking at something that costs more than the Mac Studio. So I would say, honestly, if you're heavily editing in Final Cut, then, or even in DaVinci Resolve or any of the Adobe Premiere Pro, those are currently video encoders that you get 2 of in the, or even in ProRes, that you get 2 of in the Mac Studio M1 Max. So honestly, I think I would go for that one if you're heavily editing video. I think if you're talking about longevity standpoint, obviously the M4 Mac Mini does a better job. And then also if the form factor fits better. I don't think there's inherently one better than the other. But when you look at the outright performance of the M4 chip, is just outright faster than the M1 chip. In my workflow, which one would I go with? For me, even though this thing has all the ports that I would ever need, is in a pretty good form factor. It's quite heavy, but it does do its job really, really well. And especially with longer render times, obviously the cooling would probably be a little bit better, but I think the cooling does quite well for the Mac Mini M4, and honestly I'd probably go with that because I still think having 8 GB of RAM and 16 GB of RAM is perfectly fine. It's not ideal, but I've only ran up to a few issues where having 8 gigabytes of RAM on my MacBook Air was a problem. I think the other thing to look at is the storage aspect. So for the Mac Mini M4, basically what I would end up doing is using that 256 gigabytes of SSD storage, and then essentially buying like a Chinese soldered version once the warranty went out. So that's what I would end up doing. But also the other thing is that, you know, are the improvements for the Mac Mini M4 enough to say, hey, you should upgrade? And I think probably, again, and I'm only saying this in terms of looking at it from a you do this all the time standpoint. If you don't do this all the time, it's probably not really worth it. And using, you know, your M1 or whatever Apple Silicon chip that you have probably just is fine to use. I haven't found any issues with it. There are some aspects of the active cooling that I like in comparison to the Mac Airs. But I do have another video coming out which talks a little bit about upgrading the cooling on your MacBook Air as well. So stay tuned for that and make sure you subscribe. But yeah, from looking at the overall cost and benefits and what have you, instead of buying, for example, a new MacBook Air M4, I'd rather buy an M1 Max Studio for the same cost, if that makes sense, just because you get those 2 extra encoders, or just a Mac Mini M4, because that is also quite a bit faster and it's half the price of a new MacBook Air. So yeah, I mean, the one thing that I would probably upgrade for is the better screen for like the MacBook Pros. And I wouldn't do that for any of the older models, but for the newer models, I would probably upgrade because I think it has like 1,000 nits of peak brightness, whereas the MacBook Air that I have is 400 nits. And I see a bit of an issue like when I'm like downstairs and in the sun and different things like that in direct sunlight. So other than that use case, I'd really say that the Mac Mini M4 is a really good value, and that's probably what I would go with. And then if I was thinking of upgrading like the laptop aspect of it, I'd probably keep the MacBook Air M1 and then get a Mac Studio, and then you get the extra bandwidth for memory and you'll get the extra 2 encoders and decoders. So I think that would be more beneficial than a Mac Mini M4, where the processor is much faster and then even the multi-core score is better. But again, those are my thoughts, and I'm just thinking about it in my use case. Again, I've had this Mac Studio for about 2 weeks, and being able to test it out with my use cases, I really only edit kind of low-tech videos, so I don't particularly have the largest use case for it. So that's why in my case, if thinking about upgrading, I would just upgrade to the Mac Mini M4, use that until that warranty ended, and then upgrade the storage to like a 1 or 2 terabyte SSD. But with that said, let me know in the comments what you think, and we will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.